All right, I think we are ready to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome or welcome back to our Accuro EMR tips and tricks remote learning sessions. Today's session is on macros, which can be used for everything from quickly replacing a short form of a single word with the full version of the word, right up to pre-formatting and pre-populating entire consult notes or referral letters. I would like to start by apologizing in advance for any disruptions. I'm sure the work from home routine has become the new normal for a lot of people these days. So if you hear any yowling in the background, it's either my elderly cat or my 6-month-old son, or possibly both at the same time. So macros. There have been some changes to them over the past few months to a year, including, finally, the ability to share them with other users within a single office to help standardize your documentation and save time for everyone involved. So even though we've talked about macros a little bit before, I thought it was definitely worth revisiting the subject. Now, macros can be created in a few different ways. And it used to be a real pain to enter new ones from scratch because you had to do it through an actual note of some sort, which meant loading a patient. And if you were already in a real person's chart, you had to stop and load one of our test patients just to make sure you weren't putting test documents into a real patient's chart. And then you had to get a new note open. And then you had to right click within the note and go to find macro to create one, which wasn't terribly intuitive because if you didn't have one already, how would you find it? But thankfully, there is an easier way to do it now. And that way is just by clicking on the Accuro bullseye icon. Then you can either go to Tools and then scroll all the way down to the bottom to Manage Text Macros. Or you can just click on the Accuro bullseye, type in the word macro, and that pulls it up for you right there. So to create a new macro, as with most places in Accuro, you're just going to click on the little green plus icon to enter a new one. You're going to give the macro a name, which is the word that you're going to type to pull the macro into a chart or into a document. And the name can be whatever you want. It can't contain any spaces, so it has to be all one word. You can use underscores. You can use all kinds of things. Then you click in the big text box, and that's where you type in what you want your macro to actually be. So in this case, I'm just doing a quick example macro for putting my signature on something. When you send tasks back and forth between different people, it's really helpful to be able to see who wrote what in what part of the task. So we're just going to do a little signature like that. So now we have a macro created for that. Now, this is great if you want to set up macros ahead of time. But what if you were already in a progress note? You just wrote out a really useful phrase and it's your 4th time writing it just this morning. And you think to yourself, gosh, it sure would be nice if I never had to type out that particular string of words again. So here's something that you probably see pretty often in a patient chart or in a note that you're typing out. So if you already have what you want to be in the macro in a note, you can just highlight the text that you want, then right-click on it and choose Save As Macro. Especially if you're a transcriptionist, there are probably phrases that you hear the physician say over and over. So the next time you write one of those phrases out, just highlight it, right-click, Save as Macro. Then you can give it a name that makes sense to you and click OK. Now, little time-saving tip. If you triple click in a progress note on a line of text, it will automatically select the entire line for you. So you don't need to click and drag or worry about where the mouse cursor is. Just triple click quickly in the line and it will select everything. Well, when it comes to actually using macros, they do work a little differently than the autocorrect feature that we know a lot of people had gotten kind of used to. The really nice thing about autocorrect was it made the replacement for you automatically. You just typed the shortcut you had set up, and as soon as you hit the space bar, it got changed to the full version. So you could type in the word keto, hit space, and if you had an autocorrect, it would change to ketoconazole. Conazole. And that's why somebody probably set up an autocorrect for that one. Uh, but it was that ease of use that made the autocorrect feature so problematic because it led to people putting in shortcuts for themselves that interfered with other people being able to use actual words. So the main difference from that standpoint between a macro and an autocorrect is with an autocorrect, you could just hit space. But with a macro, what you do is you type in the name of the macro, then you hit Control and Enter on the keyboard. So that's how we can use that new return in 2 weeks macro that we just set up. And there are two nice things about this, even though it's a little less convenient. First, it lets you use normal words as macros without worrying about them being auto-corrected every time you want to use them as an actual word. And secondly, it lets you get into some really neat stuff like nesting macros inside of other macros, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now, if you don't happen to remember the names of any of the macros that you've set up for yourself, if you thought maybe this was return 2 weeks, no, it wasn't called that. What was it called? You do have the option of right-clicking in a progress note or any type of note, going to Find Macro, and then that pulls up the same macro manager that you can get to right from the Accuro bullseye, and you can just click on the macro you want, click Select, and it'll put it right into the note for you. So what else can we use macros for? We can use them for individual words. We can use them for short phrases. We can also use them for longer notes. And if we want to get fancy, we can use them to pull in information from the EMR, like the date or the patient's name. And we can use them to simplify note-taking and charting by letting us set up clickable words, where we can just select one or more options from a list and have Accuro dynamically generate a grammatically correct sentence containing those options. Now, in their simplest form, clickable words can be used to quickly indicate yes or no responses to pre-written questions. Let's use as an example an ear flush. I'm on my demo clinical account, so we're pretending I'm a nurse today. So a patient has come into the office for an ear flush. I need to chart that. So I'm going to open up a nurse's note, and I have a macro called ear 3. And when I enter it and press Control Enter, this is what pops up. So everything contained in these square brackets is a clickable option. I'm actually going to redo this one because that counts as selecting them. So everything in the square brackets is a clickable option. And the way these work is if you double click on a single item within a clickable list, it will just choose that option and it gets rid of everything else. Or if you want to choose multiple options from the list, you can just click and then double click on the last one you want to select. And Accuro will do some nice little formatting to automatically put in any appropriate commas and even the word "and" at the end. Unfortunately, Accuro does not seem to believe in the Oxford comma, which I do, but I suspect that level of grammatical nuance is probably pretty low on their list of features to add. Then you just go down through the rest of the list, double clicking on the appropriate options. That's fine, all good. So this is one type of note that you can create with a macro. And depending on how detailed you want your patient notes to be, maybe this note is good enough. But if you're already going to use a macro to simplify your note taking, why not go ahead and format things a bit more nicely because it isn't any more work to use. But why not use sentences instead of just point forms? Why not include some additional patient details? Here's a different version of the ear flush macro that I've set up. And again, see how nice it is that we can just type in the word ear normally and it doesn't autocorrect. But if we want to use it as a macro, it's just 2 little keyboard strokes and there it is. So this is no more work for the nurse to enter, really. It's a sort of intermediate version, so it has some of the responses typed out instead of as yes or no options. It also includes a signature by the author, which I know that the College of Nurses of Ontario has some pretty strong opinions about including. And macros can be a great way to make sure you never forget to sign off on your documentation. It also has some dynamic features. It's pulling in the current date and it's pulling in the current time. And entering the information is just as easy. Double click to select one item within a list, or click and then double click on the last item to select multiples. So this would be a pretty good way to chart an ear flush, but can we go into even more detail? Well, of course we can. And here is a third version. Again, this one is no more work for the nurse to enter once the macro has been created, but the level of documentation is now top-notch. There are no abbreviations. Everything is written out. There's proper grammar and spelling for everything. There is a title for the note. There is the current date. There are clickable options that this time include some granular detail. We're going to say bilateral, pain, pressure, and hearing impairment. And this option here, we can either, if there is significant wax buildup, we can double click on significant, but maybe it's just a sort of normal amount of buildup. If you include the option null in your list of clickable words, double clicking on null basically makes the list disappear. So we can either say it was significant or there was just a normal amount. Now, another feature that this particular macro has is you might notice that there are some male pronouns written in here. He, his, etc. This particular test patient happens to be a male test patient, so that's appropriate. But what if we wanted to do an ear flush on a female patient like Mindy here? So we're going to do a nurse's note. We're going to do our nice version. It's still saying he and his, and that's not right. But all we need to do is click on this little M to F button down at the bottom. And all of the male pronouns in the note get automatically converted to their female equivalents. There is no gender neutral option at this time. There's no option to put in the patient's preferred pronouns. It's just male to female. But at least it lets you write all of your macros with the male gender. And if it happens to be a female patient, you just click this button and it fixes it. Now, I was actually grumbling a little bit just before this presentation because I was testing stuff out. And I was saying, well, heck, my male to female button isn't working. I'm clicking on it and nothing's happening. What's wrong? And it took consulting with 3 other people from the IT department, including the now absent and much missed Kelly, for us to sort of come to the collective understanding that the problem was I was on a male patient. So if you're on a male patient, somebody who has their gender set in Accuro as male, and you click on that male to female button, nothing happens. So you don't need to worry about accidentally misgendering a patient who is male. You just need to remember to do it for female patients. So there are some even more advanced ways that we can use macros. Offices send a lot of referral letters, and referral letters can be kind of tricky to sort of automate because there are so many different variables involved in them. If you're sending a patient back to a specialist that they've already been going to for years, you basically just need to say, "Hi, Dr. So-and-so, thanks for continuing to see this patient. Sincerely, Dr. X," and that's good enough. But if you're sending a patient to a new specialist, somebody they've never seen, or it's a new condition, then there's often a lot of additional detail that you need to be able to choose to include. Things like, have you ordered investigations? Are they attached to this letter? Will they be sent along later? Which investigations have you ordered? How much medical history do you want to include? So I have a macro set up here for referrals, and we're just going to go through this one. So when you first put it in, it looks like a bit of a mess, but as we go through it, it's going to really simplify and clean up nicely. So thank you for consulting with, and here we pull in the patient title, Mrs. Patient last name, a pleasant, because patients are always pleasant, age in units, then gender, regarding, and here's where you type in chronic knee pain. And now we have some options. We can either say, I have ordered things, or I am in the process of ordering them. So let's say I have ordered. And now we can choose no investigations at this time if we're just referring a patient back to an existing specialist that they know. Or let's say we do want to specify that we've ordered a bunch of things. Let's double click on this. And now this word itself is also a macro. If we press Control Enter with the cursor at the end of this word invest, there's a whole other macro that we can bring in. So let's say we've ordered blood work, an ultrasound, and an MRI. And there it is. Another minor little difference about this one is you'll notice we don't have the commas and the and, because this specific macro is formatted as a list. And I'll show you how that's done. Then we can choose between the results are attached because they've already been done, results are pending, will be forwarded to your office upon receipt, or if we've said that we're not investigating anything, if we click the null option here, it just gets rid of that entire sentence. So let's say we're attaching these. Relevant medical history details for this patient are presented below. Now, the formatting of outgoing referral letters is a source of some contention. It is messy. It is messy. It is difficult to choose what you want to be included. Sometimes the information ends up duplicating. Sometimes it shows up at the top of the referral letter, depending on how you're bringing it in. Macros are a way that you can choose some information that you want to be included or excluded on the fly. It doesn't unfortunately work for every type of information you might want to pull in from their CPP, but it does work for quite a few things. So known allergies. If this patient is being referred for a rheumatological condition, or if they're going to an allergist, obviously you want that. But if a patient has knee pain, is it really relevant that they're allergic to penicillin? Probably not. So if we double click on the null option here, it just gets rid of that completely. Lifestyle notes. Depending on where the patient is being referred, that might be something you want to include. You know, if they're going off to an addiction specialist and they have cocaine use because they like the snow, I'm not sure how that one got in there, and they smoke a pack a day and have for the past 20 years, and they drink a 12-pack every night, you probably want to include that lifestyle information in your referral letter. But if you're referring them to a specialist for basic knee pain, you probably don't need that, so you can double click null. Or let's say in this case, we do want to include it. So we just double click on the lifestyle notes section, and that pulls it in. Past medical surgical history. This patient doesn't have any, but if we did want to include it, we would just double click there. Now, these last two items, problem history and active medications, There is not, unfortunately, a way to choose to include or exclude those because the way these ones are formatted, they actually have square brackets within them. So there's no way to tell Accuro, pay attention to these square brackets on the outside, but ignore these ones on the inside. So those ones pretty much have to be in if you're choosing to include them in your macro. But we have very quickly written a very concise, focused referral letter that specifies what's being done, whether it's included or not. We've got some relevant medical history details, and that was all done through a macro. The only thing we had to type in was what the patient is being seen for. And we can, of course, include other details if we want to. We can say how long this issue has been going on for. So what I'm going to do is just show you quickly what that specific macro looks like. So this is how it's formatted in the macro manager itself. So thank you for consulting with, and then pulling in information from the EMR is as easy as right-clicking and choosing the information we want to pull. So if we want to say, thank you for consulting with Mrs. Smith, we can say, thank you for consulting, right-click, patient title for Mrs., patient last name for Smith, a pleasant patient age in units, if we want to say 57-year-old, patient gender full, if we want to say male or female. So that's all information that you don't need to write out yourself ever in a referral letter if you just set up a macro that pulls it in for you. Here we can see that we've got the word invest, and we have a separate macro for invest, which actually pulls in the information that we want or gives us those options to choose between. There is no limit to the amount of recursive macros you can set up. If you wanted to specify what types of blood work, you could make a macro called blood work. And you could have list options in there for HbA1c, eGFR, lipids, whatever, that you could click between. And then when you're using the macro in a note, you have your referral, you control enter after invest, so you're pulling in that macro. Then you would just control enter after blood work in the note, and you could pull in the blood work macro to specify even more detail. So spaces can be pre-formatted, whether periods are included in a macro itself, or if they should go at the end of the macro. So you can get into a lot of detail with these things. And for the patient history stuff down at the bottom, again, we're just right-clicking and going to medical history, and there are all the options that we can choose between. If you're referring a patient to a gynecologist and you want to include a summary of their latest PAP results, and you know that your staff always put those results in preventative health maintenance, you can choose to include preventative health maintenance. You could even set up multiple different versions of a referral macro, depending on how much information you wanted to include. But the nice thing about this null option is, as long as it's a category that doesn't have square brackets in it, excluding it is as easy as double-clicking on null. Now, the last thing I want to cover about macros is sharing them. Sharing macros is something that we used to flail our arms at and say, no, please don't, not ever, don't share macros, because sharing macros used to be done through a little checkbox. And what that checkbox did was it put your macro, whatever it was named, in the list of literally everybody's macros who uses our Accuro. And if any of those people decided, I really don't like that macro, they could delete it, and it would be deleted for everyone, including you. So we used to tell people, don't share macros, because if you do, they'll be deleted and gone forever, and there's nothing we can do about it, and we can't even tell you who did it. If you want to share macros, you'll have to open a test patient and put the macro into a note, and then tell whoever you want to share the macro with which test patient you used and what the note is, and it was quite cumbersome. But Now, you do have the option to share macros with any office that you have access to. So if there are going to be multiple people in your office who are, I'm actually not going to change that one, I'm going to change this one. Let's say you've got a couple of different nurses in your office and you want all of your nurses to be able to have access to the same macro. You can set the share level to office, and then any user in your office will have that macro and they can all use it. Now, it is technically possible to share macros with multiple other offices, but I would recommend caution with that, because if you share a macro with another office, it has to be an office that you specifically have access to. But if anyone from that second office wants to delete the macro because they don't like it, then it deletes it for all of the offices. So if you're a nurse and you work in more than one office and you want to be able to use your favorite macros with your coworkers at both offices, one option would be to share it temporarily and then rename it for one of the offices and then unshare it. Basically, you just want to avoid a situation where your macro could end up being deleted by somebody who might not necessarily know what it's for. So that is pretty much it for our sort of quick overview of macros and their options. Uh, if anyone has any questions, feel free to stick around and type them into the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending today. I hope people learned something, and we will be posting this on YouTube. Oh, and one last thing. Uh, if physicians in particular are interested in sharing their macros with each other, the Physician Base Camp would be a great place to do that. If you've got any ideas about if you want help with formatting a particular macro, if you want to know what other people are using, talk about it on Basecamp, because that's a great way that you can share stuff. You can just copy and paste from there right into Accuro. And I will probably end up pasting a couple of these on Basecamp as well in the IT department section, just so that people can access them. And thanks very much.